Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a video called Using Group Policy to Simplify Network Administration. In this video, we have a lot to go over. We're going to start off by doing a review of how Active Directory is put together. As an administrator, you should have a pretty good understanding of Active Directory, but just in case, we're going to go ahead and go over the high points, because without understanding that, there's no way to understand exactly how group policy works. Then we'll go ahead and take a look at exactly what a GPO is. GPO stands for Group Policy Object, and we'll see what that is within Active Directory. Then we're going to take a look at Global Mantic's scenario and see what the problems are that the Global Mantic Corporation is currently facing, and we'll see how to solve that using group policy. Then we'll go in and use the group policy management tool to go ahead and create and link GPOs, edit and view the GPO settings, and then I'll introduce you into something that is new to Windows Server 2008, which is something called a starter GPO. Then we'll take a look at how GPOs get applied by default, and then after we see how they're applied by default, well, we'll go over the exceptions to the rules. And then we'll take a look at a couple of wizards called Group Policy Modeling and Results to see how to analyze exactly what effects group policy is having on our network. And then we're going to wrap things up with another new feature to Windows Server 2008, and that is something called the Password Setting Object. Password Setting Object is something that allows us to now differentiate password rules within a domain, whereas in the past we had to do it on a domain by domain basis. Alright, well, let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing we're going to do here is review the Active Directory infrastructure. And this infrastructure is primarily made up of a logical structure, a physical structure, and then there's also this hierarchical structure of objects within the Active Directory database itself. Now, the one thing I want to tell you before we go over each one of these is please make sure that you keep absolute separation between the logical structure and the physical structure. And the reason why is because there can be a lot of confusion as to how certain things are possible. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I know lots of administrators who have gotten stuck based upon one simple statement, and that is that you can have multiple domains within a single site, and you can also have multiple sites spanning a single domain. Kind of confusing, right? I mean, how can you have multiple of one thing inside of another and multiple of that other inside of the first? It gets very, very confusing. Well, the reason why is because there's a complete separation. One has to do with the logical aspect of things, and one has to do with the physical aspect of things. It's almost like they're in totally separate dimensions from one another. So just keep that in mind. If this is something that you have not seen before, don't try to grasp everything at once. Just take it one piece at a time. So first, we have the logical structure. And the logical structure consists of domains, which a domain is the primary administrative container within Active Directory. Now, I mentioned that the Active Directory database is a hierarchical grouping of objects. Well, these objects are in containers. And the highest level of container, if you want to call it that, at least from an administrative point of view, would be the domain. That's why we have things like domain administrators. These are the users who can administrate everything within this top level container. The next item we have is called a tree. Now, a tree is an area of namespace containing one or more domains. And I say one or more because a lot of people think of a domain as an area of namespace. Well, a tree is really a hierarchical namespace containing one or more domains. So for instance, we might have globalmantics.com, and then we have asia.globalmantics.com. That's what we mean by hierarchical, where we have a parent-child relationship and the child contains the parent's name within. And then a forest, here's my favorite one. A forest, if we just kind of Forget about technology and forget about anything we've read. Well, it's real simple. A forest, it's a bunch of trees, right? Well, of course, it is a bunch of trees, but it's also considered to be the top of the overall Active Directory hierarchy. And the reality is not only is a forest a bunch of trees in real life, like as in if you're going through the forest, don't run into a tree, right? Well, in Active Directory, a forest can be one tree or can be two trees or three trees. It can be a bunch of trees. Now we'll see this all come together as we go through the rest of this. But first, just to see if we can help you to understand here's the basic logical structure of our GlobalMantics network. We have three domains. Okay, we have globalmantics.com, na.globalmantics.com, and asia.globalmantics.com. Okay, so those are the domains. Now, in this particular instance, we have one tree. Okay, we know it's a tree because we have this top domain, but then each of the other two domains share the namespace. In other words, they all share this globalmantics.com namespace. So that's what makes this a single tree. And because this is all part of one overall Active Directory infrastructure, this is also the GlobalMantics forest. Okay, so that's the logical structure of our GlobalMantics network. Now let's talk about the physical structure. The physical structure is made up of domain controllers, which are quite simply the computers that hold copies of the Active Directory database. Okay, that's a fairly common term, domain controllers. A lot of people try to associate domain controllers as domains, but the reality is domain is a logical unit, whereas a domain controller is a physical computer. And then we have sites. And a site represents a physical location containing domain controllers. Now, all of the domain controllers within a certain site should be connected via high-speed network connection, such as an Ethernet connection. Whereas different sites are typically separated by a slower WAN connection. So we may have a T1 line connecting two different locations from one another. Now here again, we have the GlobalMantics physical structure. We have the New York office. Okay, so this is one location that is connected by a high-speed connection within the network. And we have 4 domain controllers in New York. Okay, we'll just simply call them New York DC 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we have the Chicago site. And the Chicago site has 2 domain controllers, Chicago DC 1 and 2. Now, what makes them different sites? Well, we have a high-speed Ethernet connection in New York and a high-speed Ethernet connection in Chicago, but we have this slower WAN connection separating the two cities. And what that means is all of these domain controllers, the 4 domain controllers up in New York, well, they can all communicate with each other quickly and efficiently. And the 2 in Chicago can also communicate with each other quickly and efficiently. But in order to communicate between offices, we have to go across this slow WAN link, and so therefore there might be some delay. Now, just to continue the physical structure, we also have a Tokyo site which has 2 domain controllers and our Dallas site with a single domain controller. Now, you'll notice here that I have no mention about domains, trees, or forests at all. Okay, and this is what I mean by complete separation. This is strictly the physical aspect of things. Where physically are our domain controllers, and the sites show where we have physical separation through slow links. I mean, the reality here is that globalmantics.com is in the New York site only. We have asia.globalmantics.com, which is in the Tokyo site only. And then we have na.globalmantics.com, which happens to be in both Chicago and Dallas. Okay, so it does all eventually come together, but for right now, let's just keep it separate. We know what our domains, trees, and forests are, and now we know what our domain controllers and sites are. Next, let's take a look at the objects within the Active Directory database. Now, there's two different types of objects. We have container objects and leaf objects. And as I mentioned before, a leaf object is going to be any object that does not hold any other objects. Okay, so a couple examples would be either users or computers. But now container objects do hold other objects, and the most common type of container object is something called an OU, which stands for Organizational Unit. And a good OU design supports three main functions. The first one is kind of obvious just from its name, and that is to give good organization to your structure. Okay, I mean, the word is right there, organization, organizational unit. Part of the purpose of these organizational units is to just keep things looking nice, make things easy to find. Okay, and that actually ends up being, in many cases, the least priority of the three functions here. Now, the second function would be something called delegation of control. Now, delegation of control is the concept of going ahead and taking certain areas of the Active Directory database and allowing other users, delegating out to other users, the process of administrating those areas of Active Directory. Now, this is something we'll talk about in detail in the next video. But the third function is group policy management. And that is something, obviously, we're talking about right here, right now. It's the whole purpose of this video. Group policy management is so much easier when you have an OU design to support it. So that's definitely one thing to keep in mind when you're putting your Active Directory database together, is that you're going to want to have certain areas that are going to be controlled similarly, whether it be delegation of control or whether it be group policy control. Well, you're going to want to have those objects grouped together in the same containers. All right, now let's go to a slightly different area of our Active Directory review here, and that's something called trusts. Okay, it's very important to understand trust relationships because trust has to do with how users in one domain access resources in other domains. Okay, so trust really has a major impact in the Active Directory structure. Now, the first trust that I want to talk to you about is something called parent-child trust. And this is the default trust relationship that is created in all Windows Server 2008 Active Directory databases. So by default, all domains within a single forest will have what's called a two-way transitive trust relationship with any other domain that is directly above or below them in the hierarchy. Now, we'll take a look at this in just a few minutes, but the example I could give you would be globalmantics.com is what's called our forest root. It's also a tree root. And there is a child domain underneath called na.globalmantics.com. Well, by default, there is a two-way trust relationship between those two, which basically means that anybody in either domain can access resources in the other domain. Now, obviously, permissions still come into play, but this is just the concept of even having the opportunity to look at those permissions in the first place. Now, another type of trust I'd like to talk to you about is something called a shortcut trust. A shortcut trust is a direct trust relationship that is created between two specific domains. And typically, this would be used only in a large, complex forest, or as we'll see a little bit later, if we have two or more forests that have a complete trust with each other, we may want to have a shortcut trust directly from one domain that's way down low in the hierarchy to another domain that's way down low in the hierarchy. And again, I'll show you this in a few minutes, but basically what this is going to do is it's going to prevent a lot of the ticket granting traffic that is created, the process of a user having to go from domain to domain to domain to domain to be able to eventually access a resource. This way we can go straight from one domain to another. Now, an external trust is a direct trust that's created between a domain in the forest and then a domain outside the forest, typically with old Windows NT domains. Okay, in other words, if you're going further back than Active Directory, you go older than Active Directory, an external trust is between one of your domains within the forest and that other old Windows NT domain. This is something that you're not going to see very often, and if you do, you won't see it very often going into the future because Windows NT is really a thing of the past. And the last one I have listed here is something called a realm trust, which is essentially the exact same thing as an external trust, except for that you're creating this trust between a Windows domain within the forest and a Unix realm, which is kind of like saying a Unix domain. Okay, so both the external and the realm trust are things that you won't typically see a lot of. Parent-child trust is there by default, and the shortcut trust is something that's commonly used if you have a large, complex forest. Now, let's take a look at what I was trying to mention before. Here is an example of, first of all, we have the global mantics tree / forests / set of domains right here. Right, we got them all right here. Now, globalmantics.com has a parent-child trust relationship with North America and a parent-child trust relationship with Asia. Now, here's the thing. It's a two-way transitive trust relationship. Now, the two-way part means that basically users in globalmantics can access resources in North America, and North America users can access resources in globalmantics. What transitive means is that the trust relationship can be passed through. In other words, a user in the North America domain can actually access resources in the Asia domain, because what happens is this user will go ahead and have a trust that continues and through transition has the trust relationship here. Really, it's a two-way trust relationship here. Okay? Because through transition, if A trusts B and B trusts C, then A trusts C. Did that confuse you? All right, let me clear some of that out. Now, here I've illustrated a shortcut trust that could be created between the North America domain and the Asia domain. Because a moment ago, we talked about how the North America domain and the Asia domain already have trust relationships with each other. Well, there is extra traffic that's created. If a user in North America wants to access a resource in Asia, there is going to be traffic that's going to have to pass up through globalmantics and back down to Asia. Whereas if we create a shortcut trust, we can eliminate some of that traffic by just going directly between the two domains. Now, in this particular example, that would not be very typical. You would want to have a much more extensive forest where maybe you're going up and down through 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different layers, zigzagging all over, before you are able to transition your trust all the way from one domain to another. Now, I've also written on here is an external trust relationship with an NT domain and a realm trust relationship to the Unix domain. And again, you're only going to see those in very isolated particular scenarios. Now, there are a couple of other forms of trust that I haven't gone over with you yet. One I mentioned just a few minutes ago, and that was called a forest trust, sometimes referred to as a cross-forest trust. Basically, a forest trust is just what it sounds like. It creates a trust relationship between all domains in one forest and all domains in another forest. Okay, so basically a forest trust would be used if you have a scenario where you either A, need two forests within your organization, or B, maybe where two companies have come together. Okay, maybe Company A has a forest and Company B has their own Active Directory forest, and now the two companies have merged and are going to act as one entity. Well, the easiest solution to that might be just to create a forest trust relationship between the two forests so that everybody can access resources in every other network. And again, that's another great example of where a shortcut trust may come in real handy, because now you're talking about really getting complex. Now, the last type of trust I want to talk to you about here is something called a federated trust. And this is a cross-forest trust in which communication takes place across, well, typically I should say, across the internet. And more specifically, a federated trust is a way of having access to resources in another forest via web applications. And a very typical example would be like SharePoint server. Now, you would implement a federated trust by using the Active Directory Federation Services role. So this is a whole separate role that you need to install. But basically, a federated trust is a great way to only give access to a certain portion of your resources to an external company or somebody else you have an association with. Okay, so maybe there's another company that you do business with and you want to go ahead and allow certain access to certain resources. Well, but you don't really want to make a complete forest trust relationship. You want to have some level of control, and you may not be in the same physical building, and you may not be in a position to have a direct dedicated link. So if you're doing this across the internet, you can use web applications to go ahead and provide access to those specific resources. So now that we know what the basic structure of Active Directory is, we need to talk about one special type of object that you'll find in the Active Directory database, and that's called a group policy object, or what's more commonly referred to as just simply GPO. Now, a GPO is an Active Directory object which contains configuration settings for computers and or users. Now, when we get into actually looking at one of these objects, you'll see the breakdown about where certain things control computers and certain things control users. Now, GPOs are used to simplify network administration, which is the title of this video, and it does so by allowing administrators to establish settings once. So as an administrator, you just go in and set the settings once, and then those settings will be applied to many users and computers again and again and again. Whereas in the old days, we had to go around from computer to computer to computer and configure them. Even though we'd have the exact same configuration, we'd go to each and every machine and have a punch list in front of us. Well, now we can go ahead and set the settings once, and then every time a computer turns on or a user logs in, those settings will be applied. And if a user out on the network were to make changes to those settings, well, as soon as the computer is rebooted or the user logs off and logs on again, the GPO will go ahead and set the original settings that you, the administrator, wanted all over again. Now, GPOs are what's called linked to containers. And we'll take a look at the specific containers in just a few minutes. But GPOs are linked to containers, and the significance to that is that all GPO settings will be applied to the user and or computer objects that are within that container, the container in which the GPO is linked to. And that is also why it is so important that your OU design is created to support group policy, is because that's the way this all works. You create a bunch of settings and then you associate those settings with one of those containers, and then it affects everything within the container. Now, what do we got going on in Global Mantics? Well, for this lesson, we're going to be working in the Chicago office in the northamerica.globalmantics.com domain. Now, before we go into what's going on in this office, we need to first establish how the office is formatted. Now, this office has 80 users, 10 are in upper management, we have 10 sales users, we have 50 call center workers, so we have a call center in Chicago. We have 5 call center managers, and these guys are different than the 10 upper management users. And then we also have 5 IT administrators. And I will tell you that I have gone in to my North America domain, and I have created these 80 users. You can do so as well, or you could probably get away with just creating a few users to represent each of these different areas. Now, to go a step further, the Active Directory OU structure consists of 2 top-level OUs, one for the Chicago office and one for the Dallas office. Okay, so we have an OU called Chicago and an OU called Dallas in the North America domain. The Chicago OU then contains child OUs for the sales department, operations department, call center department, and management. I don't know if that's really a department, but management. The call center OU then has 5 child OUs within it for users who report to each of the 5 call center managers. Now there's also a global security group within this domain called IT admins, and of course the 5 IT administrators are a member of the IT admins group. This I have also already created in my Active Directory infrastructure here, and you could do that as well on your end if you're trying to follow along. We'll take a look at that in just a few moments. Okay, so now the actual scenario. Here's our goals. The goals as they have been set for this office, really I shouldn't even say the office because some of this is the entire domain and some is the Chicago office. No one in the North America domain should be able to add any removable devices to their computers except members of the IT admins group. Okay, and if you're wondering, if you're thinking, well, what do you mean removable devices? The most common removable device these days would be a USB hard drive. Okay, that's a very common device that people will just go ahead and bring their hard drive and connect it to the computer to try to copy something on or off the computer. Well, that can create a real hazard. So the rule that we're going to set here is that no one in the domain can do this other than IT admins, because obviously there are instances where this does need to happen, and we want to make sure IT is involved. All right, the second goal is that all of the sales staff in Chicago need to have a shortcut to an important document on their desktop. All right, so one of the things we want to do is make sure that that shortcut appears on the desktop of all the computers that the sales staff would use. So we'll go ahead and make sure that happens. Third goal is no one in the domain should be able to use the Add Remove Programs Control Panel applet except operations staff in the Chicago office. Okay, so we don't want anybody adding and removing programs, and one of the easiest ways to do this is to just eliminate the control panel applet for Add Remove Programs. Now, an experienced user will know that just eliminating that control panel entry does not necessarily stop you from installing or removing a program, but what it will do is it'll keep the novice user from messing around. So we want to go ahead and make sure that pretty much that happens for everybody other than the operations staff. And the last goal we have here is that the IT administrators need to have different password requirements than everyone else. So we'll actually do that at the end using the password setting objects that I talked to you about at the very beginning of this video. Alright, so those are the goals that we're going to accomplish before we're done with this video as a whole. Now let's go in and take a look at how this is all put together. We're going to look at a tool called the Group Policy Management tool, and it's in this tool that we can begin creating and linking GPOs to go ahead and satisfy some of these goals that we were just talking about. We can also use the tool to edit and view GPO settings. And then I'll also show you something that is new to Windows Server 2008 called Starter GPOs. So let's go take a look at that right now. Alright, for this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and connect to a domain controller called Chicago DC1. Now this is one of the domain controllers that I had mentioned early on in the course that you're going to want to have running at all times, because pretty much this is the domain controller that will maintain the North America domain. And likewise, it's also the domain controller where we can manage the North America domain. So what I have here on my computer is a remote desktop connection to that particular computer. So let me go ahead and double click on that. And this connection has been saved to go ahead and log in as the North America administrator account. Now that we're connected to the Chicago DC1 computer, the first thing I want to show you before we even get into the Group Policy Management tool is I want to show you the Active Directory structure that I've created. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Start, Administrative Tools, Active Directory, Users and Computers. And you will see here that I have an OU structure that's been created inside of my North America domain. I have a Chicago office organizational unit and a Dallas office organizational unit. The Chicago office has been broken down into call center, management, operations, and sales. And the call center OU is further broken down into the 5 management teams within that call center. Now, directly within the Chicago container, you will also notice that there is a security group that I've created called IT admins. And if I go into the IT admins properties and click on members, you'll see that we have our 5 IT administrators already as a member of this group. Now, if you're trying to follow along, feel free to go ahead and pause the video and create a similar structure. But I will tell you, you don't necessarily have to create all 80 users. You could probably create a small sampling to represent the different users throughout the network if you want to save some time. So let me go ahead and close out of Active Directory Users and Computers, and let's go ahead and take a look at the Group Policy Management tool. So I'm going to click on Start, Administrative Tools, and you will see here that we have an entry for Group Policy Management. Now before we go to this tool, one last thing I want to show you is if you don't see this tool for some reason, I mean, you may be looking at your menu right now and you may not see that tool. This is a feature that was installed when I installed the Active Directory Domain Services role. If for some reason it did not install on your machine, or maybe you're not on the same domain controller that I am, what you need to do is go up to the Server Manager, and in the Server Manager, I'm going to click on Features. You'll see here that there's 2 features installed, and one of them is Group Policy Management. If it's not there on your computer, then simply click Add Features and then check the box to go ahead and add the Group Policy Management feature. But since it is on my computer, I will just close out of the Server Manager, click Start, Administrative Tools, and let's select Group Policy Management. Alright, now here in the Group Policy Management tool, you'll see that we have our forest, which I can expand, and I can take a look at the different domains that I have access to. You'll notice the only domain I have access to is North America, and that's because I'm logged in as the North America administrator. And we could also see our sites, so our different locations can be viewed under sites. But right now we're only going to be dealing with the Chicago location, so let's expand North America, and you will see again here I have the different OU breakdown of Chicago and Dallas, and then inside Chicago is call center management, operations, and sales, and the call center is broken down into the 5 different teams. Great. Why do we have this? Well, because again, group policy objects need to be linked to containers to affect the users and computer objects within those containers. In order for that to happen, we need to go ahead and see all these containers in the Group Policy Management tool. Now you'll notice right here that there's a container for Group Policy Objects. Let me click on that. This is a generic holder for all Group Policy Objects within the North America domain. Objects that exist within this container don't necessarily have any effect on anybody or anything in our network. The only way that a group policy object is going to affect a user or computer would be by linking it to an actual container within Active Directory. Now, I think I've told you this way too many times already, but it is a very significant thing to understand. Now, if we want to create a group policy object, all I have to do is either right-click on the container, or I can even right-click anywhere in this blank area. Let me right-click and select New. And then it asks me for the name of the group policy object that I want to create. Now, one of the group policies, or I should say one of the goals that we had, was to go ahead and not allow anybody to go ahead and add removable devices onto their computer. So let's go ahead and name this one Block Removable Device Installation. Okay, that's what we'll name this group policy. And I'll click OK. And now I have a group policy object in the domain called Block Removable Device Installation. Great. Let me tell you something. We've accomplished nothing. For 2 very specific reasons, this group policy object really serves no purpose right now. The first reason is, well, although we've created a GPO, we have not actually gone in and set any settings. So until settings are set, the group policy object really serves no purpose. Now, the second reason that this particular group policy object serves no purpose is that it's not linked to any container. It's just sitting in the generic group policy objects container. So maybe we should go ahead and link this group policy object. Now I'm going to go ahead and link this to the domain. And the reason I want to link it to the domain container is because the goal that we had listed in the Global Mantix network is that nobody in the domain should be able to do this, other than the exception of those IT administrators, but we'll come back to that exception in a little bit later. So the way I link it to the domain is by right-clicking on the domain itself, and then selecting Link an Existing GPO, and then picking the GPO. Here's Block Removable Device Installation. And click OK. And now we've kind of completed step one of the two steps that we have to do to make this group policy actually do something. Step one is we linked it. The next thing we have to do is actually set some settings. But before we do that, I want to show you another way of creating and linking a GPO all in one step. Okay, because there's another GPO that we need to create at the domain level, and that was the blocking of add remove programs, right? That was another thing that we wanted to do for the entire domain. So I'm going to right click on the domain, and I'm going to select create a GPO in the domain and link it here. Now I get that same message to go ahead and give it a name, and so this time we're going to, how about we'll say disable add remove programs. Click OK. And now up here on the domain, you'll see that we have added another GPO called disable add remove programs. But also if I click down here on the group policy objects container, there we have the disable add remove programs GPO as well. Okay, so if you know that there's a specific spot that you're going to go ahead and link a GPO to, then you can go ahead and create and link it right on the container. Now one more that we need to create, let me go ahead and expand Chicago and go ahead and right click on sales and create and link a GPO here. And if you look back on the goals, you will see here that there's a shortcut that needs to be created for all of the sales users. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and go on the sales container here and create a GPO called create shortcut on desktop and click OK. So now we have created 3 GPOs, and you'll see here that they all exist here in this group policy objects container. Matter of fact, in case you're wondering, you'll notice there are 2 other GPOs that are there by default. There's the default domain policy, which you can also see up here as being linked to the domain. That comes with the operating system by default, with Active Directory by default. And then we also have the default domain controllers policy, and this one, let me go ahead and expand domain controllers. You'll see here that that one is linked to the domain controllers organizational unit by default. And pretty much they are just what they sound like. The default domain policy is just to have a set of settings that affects everybody and everything in the domain. Some people believe that it is better to modify this policy than to create these other group policies that I created. And other people believe that you should create individual policies for the different areas of management. And more specifically, for all intents and purposes, you just never touch the default domain policy. Either way, there is no one right or wrong. These are just different ways of thinking. Now, the default domain controllers policy, again, is by default rules that will apply to all domain controllers within the domain. And why do we want that? Well, because we might want to have a stricter set of rules on our domain controllers since they are such important servers in our network. But anyway, we've added these 3 group policy objects. We've also linked them to the appropriate containers. Now we have to go in and configure the settings. So if we start off here with block removable device installation, Now when you click on it, you'll notice that you get this little warning message. It's kind of a warning. It doesn't have the warning symbol. It says you selected a link to a GPO, except for changes to link properties. Changes you make here are global and they'll affect other places that the GPO is linked. All it's basically saying is, look, one GPO may be linked to many different locations. Because I clicked on it here as opposed to clicking on it down here in the group policy objects container, it's just giving me this little warning saying, hey, you know anything you do here, you're affecting everywhere that it's linked. All right, I know that to be true, so I'm going to say don't bother me with that anymore. Click OK. Now that I've highlighted on block removable device installation, I'm going to click on the Settings tab. And this is how I can view things that are set within this group policy object. And I will tell you, if you've ever worked with group policies back on Windows 2000, we didn't have this tool available to us back then, and we could not see one quick report of settings. We used to have to go in and manually look at everything piece by piece, step by step. So this is kind of a nice feature that we have available to us right now. And you'll notice, even if I click Show All or Hide All, it doesn't really matter because there's nothing set. Under Computer Settings, nothing. Under User Settings, nothing. Right? We haven't done anything yet. So let's change that. I'm going to go ahead and right click on Block Removable Device Installation and select Edit. This is going to allow me to go in and edit and configure those settings. Now you'll notice that this is broken down into two main areas, computer configuration and user configuration. Now, one other thing that we have that's brand new to Windows Server 2008 is that we have each configuration side also further broken down into policies and preferences. See, we used to only have the policies. Preferences is something that's brand new to Windows Server 2008, and really the best way to describe it is I have had many people approach me over the years. Very often it would be a former student of mine. I'd run into this student somewhere else. Or maybe I would have this student again in a later class. And this student would say, hey, you know what? On my network, we're trying to accomplish something. And I took your class and I learned a lot about group policy. And you know what? I was thinking, can I use group policy to accomplish this goal? And the answer I would be able to give to that person, for all intents and purposes, 100% of the time, was yes. And the reason why is because either there was a setting specifically in group policy, or if there wasn't, you could write a script to perform the function and then go ahead and, if I expand policies here and expand Windows settings, you'll see here that we have scripts. And we also have that under user configuration as well. But basically you can go ahead and launch the script via group policy. Well, that was all great, but now we have these preferences which simplify things even further to where we kind of don't need to do all those fancy scripts that we used to have to do. Microsoft took some of the common scripts that a lot of people were doing and go ahead and turn them into preferences. But we'll come back to that in just a few minutes because there is one of our group policy objects that is going to have to set a preference. But for this one, we need to go ahead and expand computer configuration policies. And then we're going to further expand administrative templates, which is a bunch of registry settings. And then I'm going to go under System. And then if I expand device installation, here's device installation restrictions. If I highlight that, you'll see here that we have an entry for prevent installation of removable devices. And if I click on it, you'll see here's an explanation of everything that we have as far as preventing installation of removable devices. All right. Now, in an effort to try to be able to see this screen a little better, I'm going to click on the Standard tab, which means this explanation goes away, so that you can see over here that it's presently not configured. Now I'm going to double click on it. And a couple of things I want to show you here. One, if I click on the Explain tab, here's that explanation again. So even though I'm looking at it in a standard view where I don't have to be bothered with it over here, if I ever need that explanation, I can see it right here. But if I go back to the setting, this setting can either be not configured, which means, look, I'm just not even going to touch that registry setting. However it's set, it's set. Or I could enable it, and by enabling this setting, I am indeed preventing the installation of removable devices. Or if I disable it, that means I'm specifically not preventing or allowing the installation of removable devices. So we want to prevent this, so I'm going to enable the setting and click OK. And now you'll see that it is enabled. Now, just so you know, you might have been kind of following along thinking, how the heck did he know to go under Computer Configuration, Policies, Administrative Templates, System, Device Installation Restrictions? Well, here's how I knew. Let me go ahead and bring this all back up. When I expand Administrative Templates, there is an opportunity here to click on All Settings. This will show me all of the settings within all of these different subcontainers. And you will notice as I scroll down through here that there are thousands and thousands of these settings. So you can browse through all these settings if you like, or there's a much better way to do it. And the better way to do it is to right click on all settings and go to Filter Options. And then you could go ahead and filter. So as for instance, you can see here I was filtering for the word installation. When I click OK, now this was only a guess, but it was a good guess because I was able to narrow this down, first of all, to a much smaller list to be able to browse. And I didn't have to go very far in the list to go ahead and find prevent installation of removable devices. That's the one I was looking for. Now I can set the setting right here. Another thing that I can do, because I wanted to know exactly where this setting is if I scroll this over to the right, it shows me. It shows me that if I go under System, Device Installation Restrictions, that I will find the setting for prevent installation of removable devices. Okay, so just so you know, I'm not some kind of amazing person with a photographic memory that can memorize where every single setting is. It's just a matter of this is one that I've searched for before, and once I found it, I was able to know exactly how to navigate down to it. All right, so let's go ahead and close this editor window. And now what I'm going to do is refresh. Well, didn't mean to click there. Let me go ahead and scroll this back over. I'm going to click on the refresh button. And now it's going to generate a report of settings. And I'm going to click Show All. And now you will notice that it shows me that this particular policy has no user configuration settings. It has only a computer configuration setting. And that setting can be found under Administrative Templates, System, Device Installation Restrictions. And the policy is the preventing of the installation of removable devices, of which the setting is enabled. So that's a way of viewing exactly what's set here. Now, that might seem kind of ridiculous because there was just the one setting. But where this can come in handy is, let me go ahead and click on the default domain policy here. And then click Show All. Here you will notice that there are a number of things that are set within this particular group policy. And that can really come in handy because, again, the way we used to have to do it is we used to have to actually go into Edit. So I'm going to go in here to the Disable, Add, and Remove Programs. And I'm going to right click and edit because that's the next one we have to edit anyway. And I will tell you that the way we used to have to find things was literally by expanding policies and expanding administrative templates, control panel. I mean, you'd have to expand right on down through all of this. And you'd have to figure out what settings were set by just clicking around and seeing, well, again, it says extended, so we can't really see it, but click on standard. Look for something that was configured as either enabled or disabled as opposed to not configured. Okay, and as you can see, this would take a long time to click through each and every one. Matter of fact, even with the ability that we have right now to click on all settings, it would still take us a long time to scroll down and see everything that's been set. So that's where that settings tab comes in real handy. Now, the reason I took us into the disabling of add and remove programs GPO is because we need to set that one up. So what I'm going to do is under user configuration, Policies, Administrative Templates, Control Panel. I'm going to expand that and go to Add Remove Programs. And then here you'll see that there is an entry for the removing of add or remove programs. Let me go ahead and double click on that. If I click on Explain, you'll see here that it prevents users from using the Add Remove Programs Control Panel applet, and it actually removes it from the control panel. Okay, so this is something that it just completely takes it out so users cannot see it. It doesn't say anything in here about users not being able to install programs or delete programs. Matter of fact, it says right here, this setting does not prevent users from using other tools and methods to install or uninstall programs. This is just simply to make it that they don't see that tool, which that in itself will keep the novice user away from doing certain, well, quite frankly, stupid things that we don't want them doing. So let me go back to the setting, and we're going to go ahead and, again, enable this particular setting so that we remove that applet. Now go ahead and click OK. And now we have set up that group policy. Let me go ahead and close this. And then go ahead and let me expand this down to Sales. And then here we have the Create Shortcut on the desktop. We need to set that one up. So I'm going to right click, Edit. Now that we're in the editor for the shortcut GPO, we need to go ahead and do this through something I was just talking about a few moments ago. We need to do this through Preferences. So under User Configuration, I'm going to expand Preferences, expand Window Settings, and then here you'll see Shortcuts. And if I want to create a shortcut, now this is not just creating a shortcut right now, this is creating a shortcut for every time this group policy is put into effect. Okay, so I'm going to right click and say New Shortcut. And the action is we are going to create a shortcut, and we're going to name that shortcut Sales Doc. Okay, this shortcut to the sales document that we want all of our sales users to be able to have. As far as the location, we're going to put it on their desktop, right? And that's what the goal said. The goal said that all the sales users needed to have the sales doc or a shortcut to the sales document on their desktop. Now, as far as the target path, before I enter this, let me show you what I've done. Here on Chicago DC1 on our server, if I go into the computer on the C drive, you will see that I've created a folder called Sales. That folder is also shared. In that folder is a document called salesdoc.txt, and you'll see this is a document for the sales users. So what we're basically saying is we want the users to not have to go to Chicago DC1 to get to that document. We just want a shortcut. So the path is going to be /Chicago DC1 2K8 /sales, right? Because that's the name of the share that we created, /salesdoc.txt. And then we also have all the other settings that we could have on a shortcut, but in this case, we're going to keep it simple. Just point right to a document and click OK. So now we've gone ahead and said that pretty much anytime this group policy is affecting a user, part of that effect it's going to have is go ahead and create a shortcut to this sales document on the desktop. Let's go ahead and close out of here. Go back to our group policy management tool. And now, what have we done? Well, we have created 3 GPOs, right? We created the block removable device installation. We've created the GPO for creating a shortcut on the desktop. And we've also created a GPO which will disable the add remove programs in control panel, which does satisfy, well, it helps anyway to satisfy 3 of the goals that we had. Now, before we talk about all of the specifics about how this is going to all work and how this is going to affect the appropriate users. And remember, in our goals, we also have some exceptions where it's affect everyone, oh, but not these people. We're going to talk about all that. But I want to also show you one other thing here, which is this starter GPOs container. This is something that is new to Windows Server 2008. And although it is new, it's something that did exist before, it just wasn't quite so formal. Basically, a starter GPO is nothing more than a template that you create as a starting point. If you know that there's a typical set of settings that you always want to have applied in every GPO, or maybe there's a typical set of settings that are going to affect a certain area of a GPO, and you want to use that as a starting point and then modify from there. Well, we used to do that by just simply creating a GPO, and then what we would do is come over here and we would right click on the GPO and we would tell it to go ahead and make a copy of the GPO, and then you take that new copy and give it a new name and go ahead and make the changes on that new GPO. Well, under starter GPOs, now what we can do is create the starter GPOs folder, because we don't have any current starter GPOs. Okay, so now we have the folder. I can right click and select new, and we'll just call this demo starter GPO, because we don't really necessarily have one right now. Click OK. And if I were to go ahead and right click on it and select edit, you'll see here that really all I can do is administrative templates. I can't do any of the other stuff that you can do within a GPO. But if I were to just go ahead and let me just expand this here and just pick something here. Let's see here, desktop. How about we just remove the desktop cleanup wizard? Let me double click on that and go ahead and click enabled. Click OK. And close out of this. Okay. Now here we have this demo starter GPO. I'm going to go over to the Dallas container. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say create a GPO in this domain and link it here. That would be something you might typically do, right? Well, this GPO, we'll go ahead and say that this is a demo GPO for the Dallas office. Instead of just clicking OK like we've done before, I could use a source starter GPO and select my demo starter GPO. And when I click OK, here's what happens. I have a new GPO called Demo GPO Dallas, but if I go in to edit this GPO, you will notice, if I go ahead and expand under my user policies, administrative templates, desktop, let me click on standard, you will notice that this setting has already been set. So in other words, let me close out of here, this starter GPO was used as a template. It was used just as it sounds like, as a starting point for future GPOs. Now before we mess anything up here, let me go ahead and let me right click and delete this GPO. Oh, see, this is deleting the link, so I don't want to do that. Click on Group Policy Objects and then go ahead and right click on this and delete. Now we're deleting the GPO and all links that go with it. Alright, let's just get that extra demo one out of there. We don't want to affect anything with that. So that's a great way to go ahead and have templates as your starting points without having to go through the painful process we used to have to go through by copying them. Alright, now let's go talk a little bit about how GPOs actually get applied. So here is exactly how GPOs get applied. And I will tell you that this is probably the single most important piece of information that you're going to need to know if you're going to be managing GPOs for your organization, because this will help you to understand how to link them appropriately, but then probably more importantly, troubleshoot them effectively when there's problems. So how do they get applied? They get applied with something called LSDOU. Okay, just remember that, LSDOU. Now what does this stand for? The L stands for local. Okay, each computer has its own local group policy, its own local set of settings. The S stands for site, meaning you can link a group policy object to a site. The D stands for domain. As we saw, we could link to a domain. And the OU stands for organizational unit. We can link to matter of fact, not only can we link to organizational units, but that's the most common place where we're going to link GPOs. Now, why is this so important to understand LSDOU exactly the way I've said it? Well, because this is the order in which GPOs are applied. When a computer turns on or when a user logs in, first the local settings are looked at and applied. Then they look to see what computer this site may belong to, what location it's in, and any GPO settings that are linked to the site are then applied. And then we see what domain the computer and or user are in. And if there are any GPOs that are linked to that domain, those settings get applied. And then we take a look at the organizational unit that the computer or user are in, and if there's any GPOs linked to that container, and then those are applied. And as a matter of fact, technically, I would refer to this as LSDOU. And the reason why I say that is because if the user or computer is a member of a sub-OU, then what's going to happen is the local settings, then any site-related settings, and then any domain settings will apply. But then the topmost level OU, the parent OU settings will be applied. And then it works down through the OU hierarchy until it gets into the OU that the object actually is in. And why is this so important? Well, the reason it's important is because if there are conflicting settings, see, none of this matters if all the settings cooperate with one another, but if there are conflicting settings, then the setting that will take precedence, and pay real close attention here because very often people will have an automatic belief that either a parent wins or an automatic belief that a child wins. The way it works here is that the last setting applied takes precedence. Okay? So as a for instance, if we had a user who was sitting in, we'll say this organizational unit right here, just right on top, keep it simple. As that user logs in and goes through this LSDOU process, maybe there is a domain setting which eliminates the add remove programs from the control panel, right? That's something we just did. But there's also a group policy object that's linked to the OU that specifically adds the add remove program applet back in. Well, then what the end result's going to be for this particular user is they're going to have it. They're going to have it because the last setting to apply was the setting that was done on the OU. Now, I know this sounds fairly simple. It probably sounds like I'm taking something simple and complicating the heck out of it. But I'll tell you what, I know from many years of experience that it just is not as simple as it sounds. When you get into a larger organization and you have a lot of different IT administrators, many of whom have the ability to create and modify GPOs, you will see that there will be a lot of GPOs created linked all over the place. And when a user logs in, you're going to wonder why something worked the way it worked, or why something didn't work the way it should have worked. And the way you're going to need to go through and troubleshoot this is by just taking this one step at a time and saying, all right, if I log in as the user on a particular computer, are there any local settings? And if so, what are they? Next, what site am I in? And are there any group policy objects linked to that site? And if so, what are those settings? And are any of those settings conflicting with the local settings? Then, what domain is this user in? And are there any GPOs linked to the domain? And what are those settings? And again, do any of those conflict with any previous settings? And then we need to take a look at what OU, and possibly down through a hierarchy of OUs, that particular user is in. And then see what GPOs may be linked to the hierarchy of OUs, what the settings are, go step by step. And when you get to the end, you should know exactly how that user is being affected and why, as far as what GPOs are having that effect. Now, in a little bit here, I'm going to show you a tool that will simplify this for you. But you need to understand how it works without any tools if you really want to know how to administrate this stuff appropriately. Now, if you think you got that, I'm going to go crazy on you here. I'm going to throw some exceptions into these original default rules. And I will tell you, before we even explain these exceptions, that one thing to keep in mind is that these exceptions should all be used sparingly. And the reason why you want to use exceptions sparingly is because every time you use an exception, that's going to make your troubleshooting that much more difficult. So the first exception is something called block inheritance. Now the block inheritance setting is something that can be enabled on a container. So you don't enable it on the GPO itself. You don't enable it on the link of that GPO. You enable it on the container. And what happens is when that setting is enabled, all GPO settings that are inherited from parent containers are going to be ignored. So the LSDOU rule really doesn't matter anymore. If a user is in a particular organizational unit and the block inheritance setting has been set on that OU, then only GPOs that are linked to that OU are going to actually affect the user. The rest of the LSDOU process really just doesn't matter anymore. Now, the opposite of that would be an exception called enforced. And I will make a brief mention if you have ever worked with Windows 2000 group policy, there was a setting called no override. That setting is exactly the same as what I have listed here as enforced. Enforced is just a new name. The enforced setting is something that you enable on the GPO link. You don't actually set it on the object itself. You set it on the particular linking of that object to a particular container. And when the enforced setting is enabled, then all settings within that GPO link will take precedence if there's a conflict as it goes through the rest of the LSDOU process. Enforced also overrides block inheritance. So enforced is something that you would do higher up in the LSDOU process. Okay, you may go ahead and set some settings on the domain and then enable the enforced setting, which means, hey, look, if anybody has decided to get sneaky here and block inheritance on an OU, but yet you have a setting that you absolutely want set without fail, this is a great way to go ahead and override that block inheritance. Or another thing would be as if somebody created another group policy object at an OU level that had an opposite or conflicting setting. Well, you don't want that setting. You want the one that's enforced for everybody. You do that by setting enforced. We're going to look at all this in just a few minutes, by the way. The last exception I want to talk to you about, I don't know if I'd call it an exception. Really, there's just the two exceptions. But there is this thing here called security filtering, which is, again, not so much an exception as much as a way to further limit who a GPO is going to actually apply to. What you can do is a group policy object is an object just like any other Active Directory object, and it has permissions. And one of the permissions on the group policy object is something called the apply group policy permission. And if you take a particular group and deny the apply group policy permission, then the GPO will not affect them. But one thing to keep in mind is that by default, the GPO is going to affect all users within the container that it's linked to. And this security filtering is only further filtering down from the original group that was already filtered down to by being within that OU. So again, it's not so much an exception as much as a way to further filter who a group policy applies to. All right, now let's go back to our Global Mantic scenario here. Here we have the 4 objectives or goals. No one in the domain should be able to add or remove devices to their computers except members of the IT admins group. So how do you think we would do that? Well, the first thing is, since it says no one in the domain should be able to do this, I'm thinking that we go ahead and link this group policy object to the domain. And that is actually what we did, right? But how do we make it that the IT admins group is not affected by this? Well, we can do this with security filtering. Right? We can go ahead and take the IT admins group and deny the applied group policy on this particular GPO. So here is an example of our domain, and here's the OU structure. And here we're saying prevent the installation of removable devices, right? We have a GPO that's going to do that. Oh, this is another good idea. Enforced setting is enabled. Why? Well, because again, it said no one should be able to do this. You don't want somebody to be able to do it because some other container had another GPO that conflicted it or a block inheritance. We want to make sure that this affects everybody. But then we go ahead and put in a filter to exclude the IT admins group. Now again, I'm going to take you in and we're going to go through the steps and do this in the interface in just a few moments. But this is the way we're going to solve the goals. The second goal says all of the sales staff in Chicago need to have a shortcut to an important document on their desktop. Okay, well this is easy enough. We created a GPO to add that shortcut to the desktop and link it to the sales container. Done, right? Nothing special we have to do. No block inheritance, no enforce, no filtering. Just add the shortcut to the desktop, link it to the sales container. The third goal was to make it that no one in the domain can use the Add and Remove Programs control panel except the operations staff in Chicago. Well, the way we're going to solve this is by going ahead and doing a couple things. One, we're going to go ahead and create a GPO which removes the Add and Remove Programs from the control panel and link it to the domain. Right? That way it's everyone in the domain. But the way we're going to make it not affect users in the operations department is by going ahead and enabling the block inheritance setting on the operations organizational unit. Now, if we block inheritance on the operations organizational unit, that also means that any other GPOs that are linked higher up in the hierarchy, whether it be linked up here at the domain, or maybe if it was linked up here at the Chicago OU, none of those are going to affect the operations organizational unit. But remember, we did this enforced setting on the prevention of installation of removable devices, so that one still will affect the operations staff as we want it to do. Confused yet? All right, well, we're only trying to do 3 things. Imagine if you're trying to do 30 things within your network. This takes some serious thought and planning to make it all work. And this is a big part of why earlier I'd mentioned about how you need to have a good OU structure that supports your group policy needs. Now, the last goal in our global Mantic scenario was that the IT administrators need to have different password requirements than everybody else in the domain. And this is not done through group policy. This is going to be done through something called the password settings objects. So I'll show you that when we go into the interface. So this is the complete scenario as far as group policy objects are concerned. Now we've already started this process, right? We've already created this GPO and linked it to the domain. We've already created this GPO and we've linked it to the domain. We've already created this GPO and linked it to the sales OU. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to do a couple things here. We need to block inheritance on the operations OU, and we need to set up the enforced setting on this particular GPO, and we have to go ahead and implement security filtering. So those 3 things we have to do, plus the password settings object. So let's go look at how to do that right now. We're going to go ahead and set up that block inheritance. We're going to go ahead and set up the enforce setting. We'll do the security filter. After we've done those 3 things, we're going to then go through and take a look at a neat little wizard. There's actually a couple of them. Those are 2 different wizards. Group policy modeling is a wizard and group policy results. And then I will go ahead and show you the password settings objects. So let's go ahead and go back to our Chicago domain controller now. Okay, so here we are back on our Chicago DC1 domain controller. And what we need to now do, see, before we went ahead and we created our 3 GPOs, and we went ahead and linked our 3 GPOs to the appropriate containers, right? We have the two GPOs that we created, block removable device installation and disable add or remove programs, to the domain. And we went ahead and we linked the create shortcut on a desktop GPO to the sales OU. That part we did correctly. What we need to do now is add the additional settings. Now the first one is the blocking of removable device installation. We said that we need to go ahead and set it to enforced so that it affects everybody down through the hierarchy. So the way we do this is by right-clicking on the link. And I want to point out I'm clicking on the link as opposed to the GPO itself. And I'm going to show you this in just a moment. Because here's a setting for enforced. And just select it. And if I right-click again, you'll notice there's a checkbox. And also you'll notice a little icon has showed up to let us know that this link is now enforced. Now, what I mean by click on the link is if I come down here to Group Policy Objects, you'll notice that this same GPO does not have an icon on it. And if I right-click on it, there's no setting for enforced. Because remember, enforced is a setting that is done to the link itself. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to set up a security filter for this particular GPO because we want it to affect everybody in the domain except members of the IT administrators group. So I'm going to click on the Scope tab, and you'll notice that on the Scope tab right down here we have security filtering. The settings in this GPO can only apply to the following groups, users, and computers. And it's going to apply to all authenticated users. Now this is where we would set up security filtering if we wanted this GPO to only affect a specific user group or computer. But in this instance, we want it to affect everybody except a particular group. So we have to do this a little bit differently. We're going to go ahead and leave the security filter to say, I want this to affect all authenticated users. But then I'm going to click on the Delegation tab. And on the Delegation tab, this, by the way, is where you would go ahead and delegate out administration of the group policy object. If you want to go ahead and say that somebody else out there could go ahead and edit the settings, as a for instance, you could do that here. But to do the security filter exclusion, we need to click on Advanced. And what this does is this opens up the actual access control list for the object itself. It's like right-clicking on the object and going to the Security tab. Matter of fact, you'll notice that's what tab we're on, the Security tab. And then what we want to do is go ahead and click Add. And then we want to add the group that we're going to exclude in this security filter. And I'm going to put in IT admins. Click Check Names. There we go, IT admins. Click OK. And now I'm going to scroll down here and you'll see that there is a permission for Apply Group Policy. And so we want to deny the ability to apply this group policy to the IT admins group. And that will make it that it affects everybody within the container except this group. So I'll click OK. This is just a warning because I did a deny. Anytime you check a deny box, you see this warning because it can have ill effects. So yes, I'm okay with it. I know what I'm doing. I meant to click that deny box. And now I have set up a security filter to not have the IT admins affected by this group policy object. So we've done two of the three things we need to do. The third thing is we need to go ahead and block inheritance on the operations OU. And the reason why is because the disable add and remove programs is supposed to affect everybody except for people who are in this OU. So you right click on the OU itself and select block inheritance. And you'll see you get a little icon show up. And if I right click again, you'll see there's a checkbox there. So now the operations OU will not have any group policy objects affecting it unless they've been linked directly to this container itself, or if there's been an enforced setting set above, which we do have. So now we have successfully set up all the group policy objects exactly the way they need to be set up to meet all the goals in the Global Mantics North America domain. Now, how are we going to prove this? Well, one way we could prove this would be to go ahead and log in as different users and see what happens to them. right? Or maybe instead of us logging in as those users, just go ahead and say, go ahead users, log in, everything should work. And then wait for the phone calls to start coming in the help desk. Now, we don't want to do that. So there's a couple of tools down here, group policy modeling and group policy results, that are going to help us with this process. Now, group policy results is not really something that we would use right now. Group policy results is something you would use after people have started logging in, and when you start getting those phone calls saying, wait a minute, something's not working right. Either I have access to something I shouldn't, or I don't have access to something I should. Well, group policy results is a great way to see what happened when a user logged in. Now, there used to be a tool, matter of fact, there still is a tool from the command line called GP results, which was a text way of generating a report as to what happened when a user logged in. Group policy results is really just a graphical way of doing the exact same thing. So if I right click, just to show you this real quick, and there's not much I can show you because only one user has ever logged in, and that's the administrator account, which I'm currently logged in as right now. But let's see how it worked out. I'm going to go ahead and click on the group policy results wizard, click next on the welcome screen, and we're going to say what computer? And we'll say, well, this computer, because this is the computer that I've logged into. So this computer, and it's going to say what user. And you'll see here I actually have two users I can choose from. I could look and see what happened when the Global Mantix administrator logged in, and I can look at what happened when the North America administrator logged in. Okay, because those are the only two users who have ever logged into this computer. And click next, and next again, and what it's going to do now is it's going to go through and analyze what happened. I'm going to click Finish, and it's going to generate a report. I'm going to now click on the Settings tab of this report and click Show All. What I have here is an HTML report that's showing me all the different settings that were in effect when the North America administrator logged on to Chicago DC1. And you'll see here that password history was enforced with the last 24 passwords being remembered. Why? Well, that's because of the default domain policy. Matter of fact, that along with the password age, password length, complexity, and all the other different password policies, as well as the account lockout, etc., etc., etc. You'll notice that everything here is pretty much the default domain policy or the default domain controller's policy. Okay, that's what happened when I last logged in. This is how I can see and help troubleshoot and say, wait a minute, why did that happen? That wasn't supposed to happen. I thought I changed that. That's group policy results, and that's pretty cool. But let's look at something which I personally think is even more cool, and that is something called group policy modeling. This is where you get to do the what if query. This is where you get to say, what if user A logs onto computer B? What's going to happen? Now, before I go in and do this, we need to do one other thing. Let me go ahead and click on Start, Administrative Tools, Active Directory, Users, and Computers. The reason I wanted to come over here is because I want to show you a couple things. One, if I click on the Computers container, you'll see here that there is a computer object that's been created for Chicago XP1, and this is representative of the clients in the Chicago office. Now, don't worry if you haven't actually installed a client called Chicago XP1. All you have to do is pretty much what I did here, is right-click on the computers container, New Computer, and then just give the computer object a name. You don't have to have the actual physical computer connected to the network to test this out. Now, the other thing that I want to do here is let's go find a user that we're going to use for our example. So let's go ahead and let me go ahead and expand Chicago, and let's go down here to the sales organizational unit, and let's go ahead and pick a user. So how about we say, like right here, G. Gibbs, George Gibbs. We're going to use George Gibbs as an example of a sales user, because we want to see that that shortcut was added to George's desktop. And you know what? We'll even do two of them. Let's go ahead and let me go to operations, and let's go ahead and we'll pick the bottom one here. T. Ryan. Ted Ryan is a member of operations. We want to make sure that the add remove programs from control panel was not affecting T. Ryan. All right, so just kind of make a note here. George Gibbs, Ted Ryan. All right, let's go ahead and close this. Coming back here to our group policy management tool in group policy modeling, I'm going to right click and go into the group policy modeling wizard and click next. Now we need to pick a domain that we're going to be logging into, so we need to pick northamerica.globalmantics.com, and we're going to make sure that they're authenticating through the Chicago DC1 domain controller, because these are a couple of Chicago users. Click next. Now for user, I'm going to go ahead and browse, and let's go ahead and try this here. G. Gibbs, check names. Alright, good, it found it. When G. Gibbs logs in to, and over here again, let me go ahead and put in Chicago XP1, check names, perfect, it found it. When George logs into this computer, what's going to happen? Now there are other settings that can be set in this what if scenario, but for the most part we could say skip to the final page because we don't care about anything else. But let me clear that box. Let me show you what some of the other settings are. We can go through and we can do things like determine what if it was a slow network connection, or if we had loopback processing enabled, or if George were to move to a different organizational unit, or was a member of a different group, or had an additional filter, and all kinds of stuff. But we're not going to do any of that. We want to say, hey look, George Gibbs logged on to Chicago XP1. Let me click finish. What happened? It's going to generate a report. Let me click on settings and show all. Now what's supposed to happen? Well, let's see here. There's a bunch of default domain policy settings, and that makes sense, right? Because George is logging into the domain. But we also have here the prevention of installation of removable devices enabled. Okay? And that is happening because of the block removable device installation GPO, because that one is affecting everybody in the domain. And if we come down here, we also have add remove programs is also enabled. And why? Because again, that is also happening in the domain with a GPO called disable add remove programs. And if I continue scrolling down here, you will see here that there is the creation of a shortcut on George's desktop, and the reason why is because of the GPO called create shortcut on desktop. Okay, so what this is showing us is if we say, what if George logs into that computer, here's what's going to happen. All the default domain policy stuff, but then also each of the 3 group policy objects that we've created are also going to have an effect on George when he logs in. And we can see that through this what if statement. So let's do another one. If I right click again, group policy modeling wizard, next, North America domain, Chicago domain controller. This time the user, right, there was another user we said we wanted to do, which was T. Ryan, who's not a member of sales. T. Ryan logging into the same computer, Chicago XP1. This time I'm just going to skip to the end. Next, next, let it run its report, click finish. And here, let me go ahead and show all the settings once again. We scroll down, skip past all these default domain policy settings. What do we have? We also have the removable device installation, okay, because T. Ryan is still part of the domain, and everybody in the domain was going to have this affect them. But we no longer have the add remove programs affecting T. Ryan, and the reason why is because T. Ryan is part of the operations OU, which had that blocked. And then also you'll notice the shortcut was not created. Why? Because T. Ryan's not part of the sales OU. So again, you can see here a what if statement, what's going to happen when this user logs in, and everything seems to be working exactly like it's supposed to. So we have indeed successfully created a group policy infrastructure that should work for all of our users in the GlobalMantics North America domain. Now, the last thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and take a look at those password setting objects that I've been talking about, because we had the stipulation that we wanted the IT administrators to have a separate set of password requirements than the rest of the users within the North America domain. Now, in the past, this had to be done through group policy and had to be done at the domain level. And so what that meant was, in order to accomplish this, we basically had to go ahead and create a separate domain for the IT administrators. And that obviously doesn't make any sense. So it's pretty cool now that we have these password setting objects. Now, before I actually show you how to set these, I just want to show you, if we come up here to the default domain policy, click on settings, you'll notice here, show all, that this is where we have our account policies and password policies all set. And that is how we used to do things. So right now, all of the users in the GlobalMantics domain, or the North America domain, are going to have these particular password and account policy settings. If we want to go ahead and differentiate this for our IT administrators, we don't do it here. Let me go ahead and close out of group policy management. First thing I want to do is click on Start, Administrative Tools, and go back to Active Directory Users and Computers, because there's one thing that has to be done if we're going to use password setting objects, and that is we have to make sure that our domain is at a functional level of Windows Server 2008. So let me go ahead and right click and select Raise Domain Functional Level. And you'll see here that it's currently Windows Server 2008. That's how we had set it when we first installed this particular domain controller, and actually when we set up this domain. If you did not set it up that way, if your window currently says Windows Server 2003 or Windows 2000, then you need to go ahead and raise this functional level. There'll be a selection here to go ahead and raise it. There'll be a little drop down, and you want to raise it to Windows Server 2008. The reason why is because password setting objects are something that are new to Windows Server 2008, and you can only do it if you have exclusively Windows Server 2008 domain controllers, because Windows Server 2003 or Windows 2000 Server aren't going to know what a PSO is. So make sure you raise that domain functional level. All right, now that the domain functional level has been raised, we need to go ahead and actually create this password setting object. So what I'm going to do is click on Start, and then there's a tool we need to use. It's a pretty manual tool actually, and it's called ADSI Edit. Sometimes people refer to it as, they call it ADSI Edit. I'll actually say .msc, that's the full name. And here I'm in the ADSI editor. This is a way to kind of manually get behind the scenes of what's going on with Active Directory. You get to manually manipulate the database here. So what we need to do is, first of all, add the domain in. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and say connect to, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to connect to na.globalmantics.com. That's the domain I want to connect to. Click OK. Okay, now that I am connected to the domain, what I need to do is go ahead and expand this down. And I'll tell you, this is going to get hard to see, so let me move this over just a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and expand down the domain, and then I'm going to go ahead and double click here on this so that I can connect to it and expand it down. And then you need to go down here to System, double click on that, and expand it down. And then go down here to where it says Password Settings Container. I'm going to click on it, and then I'm going to right click on it, and then select New Object. In this dialog box, there's really one option, but you want to make sure that it is selected. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Now we need to give it a value. You see already where this is kind of like not intuitive anymore? These are very specific steps that you need to follow. So for this name, I need to give it a common name of this new password settings object. So I'm going to just go ahead and call it IT admins. And click next. And now you need to go ahead and give it a precedence. And I'll tell you what, I don't want to get into every last tiny little detail here, but basically if you have different PSOs, you can go ahead and set a precedence for it. So I'm just going to go ahead and give this a precedence of 1, because it's really the only one. And that's probably not something typical you would do. You'd probably do something more like maybe like 10, or that way you can go higher and lower, or I could have really done any number here, but we're only creating the 1. So let me click on next. And now we need to determine whether we want to have reversible encryption enabled. And I have to tell you, this is where we're getting into the actual password settings. Okay, whereas I can go back and show you in group policy the way this interface looks and how you actually have a nice friendly GUI and you have all these selections and then you enable, disable, things like that. Well, for reversible encryption, I'm going to go ahead and say false, because we don't want to enable reversible encryption for these particular accounts. Here's where we're going to do the history length. And I'm going to go ahead where the default for most users is 24. For the IT administrators, we're going to say 6. We only want to remember the last 6 passwords for our IT administrators. Click next. By the way, when we're done with all this, I'm going to explain to you exactly why I'm picking the settings that I'm picking here. As far as password complexity, we're going to go ahead and actually say true. We want password complexity to be enabled. Click next. For minimum password length, we're going to go ahead and say 12. We want to have 12 characters for an IT administrator. Click next. Minimum password age. We're not real worried about the minimum password age on our IT administrators, but we'll go ahead and set it here anyway. And this is an interesting interface. I'm going to put in 1:00:00:00:00. Now what this represents is it represents days, hours, minutes, seconds. Okay, and so what we're doing here is we're saying 1 day is the minimum password. Once a password has been set for an IT administrator, it should stay for 1 day. I will tell you that I'm populating that pretty much for the reason of having to populate something, and I don't like putting zeros in. It can work, but I don't like doing it. So we'll say 1 day. The reality is that an IT administrator can go into Active Directory and reset the password manually anyway and override this. So anyway, here's our minimum age. Next. Now our maximum password age. And this is the key. The key here is that for our IT administrators, we don't want to have to reset passwords as often as the regular users. See, regular users, they're typically going to go with the easiest password we allow them to so that they can remember it. And so therefore we want them to have to change it constantly. IT administrators, on the other hand, we don't want them to have to go ahead and reset these passwords all the time, because we're going to actually make them have to have much more complex passwords, because they're going to have to be 12 characters long. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and put in 90:00:00:00. We're going to let our IT administrators keep, only once every 3 months does an IT administrator have to change their password. Click next. Now we get into the account lockout threshold. So how many times can somebody type the wrong password and then before this account gets locked out? Well, we don't want people guessing at it, and IT administrators tend to be pretty good at remembering their password. So we're going to actually go with a small number. We're going to say only 2. Okay, that way you can accidentally type your password wrong once, but if you do it again, well, now you're going to get locked out. And at that point, you need to go get another IT administrator and get it released. Click Next. Here we have and this is an interesting verbiage on this one, the observation window for lockout of user accounts. What this means is how long before we reset that account lockout threshold timer. Okay, and really we could put in anything here. We're going to go ahead and say 0 days, 0 hours. You know, quite honestly, probably go ahead and just say 5 minutes is good enough. Okay, that means every 5 minutes we'll go ahead and say we're going to start counting again, you know, our threshold all over again from 0. That way, just, you know, if someone wants to guess a new password every 5 minutes, good for them. Go ahead and click on Next. And then here we have the lockout duration. Once the account's been locked out, how long are we going to keep it locked out? Well, in case there's no other IT administrators around, we're going to go ahead and say 0 days, 0 hours, 15 minutes. So if an IT administrator accidentally types the wrong password twice, 15 minutes later, the account will unlock itself. And click Next. And now, basically, we can just go ahead and click on Finish. And now, IT administrators have a different set of requirements than other users within the domain. Now, here's the thing. Let me give you the positive and the negative here. The positive is, first of all, you don't have to have separate domains just to have different password and account lockout policies. That's a definite positive here. But the negative is, as you can see, this is a very manual utility that you have to know exactly where to go and you have to know exactly what you're doing. And this is not a tool that any old novice or junior administrator should be playing with. This is a tool that a more senior IT administrator, an experienced IT administrator, should be playing with, because you can really cause some damage in here when it comes to your Active Directory database. All right, well, we've talked quite a bit here about Active Directory and more specifically group policy, and at this point you should now know how to describe the basic structure of Active Directory. You should know how to create and link GPOs, modify and view the GPO settings, create a starter GPO to use as a template. And again, this is something that, although it is new to Windows Server 2008, the concept's been around for a long time. The concept of using templates, you know, has always been there. It's just that we now have an interface to help us do it. You should be able to describe the process of how GPOs get applied, the whole LSDOU process, and then also the exceptions, the block inheritance, the enforced, and security filtering. You should know how to run reports to see how GPOs either have been applied using the Group Policy Results Wizard, or how they will be applied using the Group Policy Modeling Wizard. Okay, so we can do our little what-if statements. And then we should also know how to use PSOs, password setting objects, to apply different password and account lockout policies within a domain so as to not have to create separate domains for that purpose.